Thank you very much for your interest in this topic. I was going to ask you if you were nervous. And I was going to ask these guys if they were nervous. Okay? And the question, sort of bigger question of this book that I'm going to be talking about is, why are we nervous right now, if we are? And how and why can we make this nervousness work for us rather than against us? So I want to introduce these wonderful people who have taken their time to read this book that I wrote and have come here ready to discuss their reactions to it. Okay? So first we have Eileen Shakespeare. I should say who I am. I'm sorry. My name's Mica Pollock, and I'm here on the faculty. What I'm going to be talking about tonight is this book that it just came out a couple weeks ago called Colormute, Race Talk Dilemmas in an American School. Okay? So the task tonight, I should also say that, shouldn't I, is I'm going to try and lay out the main arguments of the book in around 15 minutes, 15, 20 minutes, because our conversation will be much more rich if you know what the book was about. So then we're going to open it up to a panel discussion about reaction to the book, and then we're hoping to have a full half an hour for Q&A with you guys. Okay? So thanks very much for coming. Introductions. We first have Eileen Sullivan Shakespeare, who's been teaching in Boston Public Schools since 1971. She started as a middle school English teacher and then became a humanities teacher at English High and Fenway High. She has a master's degree in English from the University of London School of Ed. And she's very interested in this question of what approaches to teaching and learning make city schools thrive. And conversely, what approaches make city schools stagnate. She's participated in dozens of professional development workshops, a long list of seminars on various professional issues. She's been a Boston Public Schools lead teacher, mentoring first-year teachers, and she's become increasingly involved over the past 10 years in teacher training. She also has a wonderful chapter called What I Would Tell a White Gal that I have, if any people are interested. I have it right in my office to read. So thanks very much to Eileen for being with us. Guadalupe Guerrero is sitting next to Eileen, and he is a grad of our own Hugsy Principals program a couple of years ago. And he's now a beginning principal in Boston Public Schools at the Dever Elementary. Before that, he had taught in a variety of kinds of schools, in public schools, charter schools, pilot schools, all at the elementary level in Boston, San Francisco, and Oakland. And 10 years total of teaching experience in bilingual ed, and he brings those interests as well as interests in special needs populations to his work as a new principal at the Dever Elementary. And he's really interested in how a large public school can provide a sense of school efficacy to its kids. Okay? So thank you very much for being here. Next to him is Mayra Levinson, who is both a researcher and a practitioner. And as a researcher, she is currently working on a book on civic and multicultural education in de facto segregated schools, communities. And she's been supported in writing this by an endless list of grants and fellowships here, the Spencer, the Radcliffe Institute. She's very committed and interested in civic education and has already written a book called The Demands of Liberal Education and the Philosophy of Education. As a practitioner, she teaches English, social studies, and humanities, and she's done that for 6 years in Atlanta Public Schools and in the Boston Public Schools. So thanks to Mayra for being here. Next to her is Janie Ward. You can see we have an incredibly distinguished panel here. The point of assembling this panel, by the way, has been to find people with experiences in different places in education so that they can have different perspectives on this question of race talk. So Janie Ward, familiar, I assume, to many of you in the audience, she is Associate Professor of Education and Human Services at Simmons here in Boston. And she also works here at Hugsy as, with Wendy Luttrell as the PI of Project Assert, which is a 5-year school-based research study and curriculum development project looking at issues of gender, culture, school practice for urban elementary and middle school teachers. She's written a bunch of books, one of them, The Skin We're In, Teaching Our Children to be Emotionally Strong, Socially Smart, and Spiritually Connected. She has her even more recent book, Gender and Teaching, and has also written a book called Souls Looking Back, Life Stories of Growing Up Black that includes a number of narratives from people who have been at Hugsy. So another work that I think many of you in the room would be interested in. And finally, Thank you, Janie. And finally, Heather Harding is here, who many of you may also know. She's an advanced doctoral student here at Hugsy, and she's, among many credentials, a teaching fellow for a number of courses in policy, school reform, race. She also has been a co-chair of the Harvard Ed Review. She supervises campus leaders now at Citizen Schools, which is an after-school program assisting middle school students. She's been a rural secondary teacher. She's worked in professional development. And as a researcher here at Hugsy, she's interested in doing qualitative research on the motivation, identity, and classroom practice of successful white teachers. She also has a publication called City Girl that's going to be coming out soon as an article, so you might want to ask her about that after the fact. So thanks very much to this panel for being here and being willing to talk about this stuff that I wrote. So what I want to try and do, as I said, is blitz through a description of what this book is trying to discuss. This book has really, been written to assist people in schools. And so I'm really here to learn from this discussion, because now I want to enter a sort of professional development phase with this work and see if it actually can assist people who are themselves thinking about race talk in education. And the book is centered in an immense respect for educators. There are educators that I wrote about and those that I hope will read it, because I think that educators are really dealing with the deepest issues of race that the country has to offer. And I think that dilemmas of talking about race, which is specifically what the book is about, are actually the dilemmas of all of us, and that educators deal with them in a just sort of more highlighted way than many people have to. But my point in this book is to lay out 6 dilemmas of race talk for explicit analysis. That's what the book is trying to do. So what do I mean by race talk in this book? What I mean is literally the everyday use of race labels. I'm interested in everyday moments when people use the word white, use the word black, use the word Latino, etc. And I'm interested in struggles over that basic thing. And I'm interested in people struggling with this question in schools of when it helps and when it harms to talk as if race matters. I'm interested in a spectrum all the way from the private struggle of a person, this might be a familiar example to you, saying, wondering to his or herself, should I describe this kid in racial terms? So this person says to you, you know, he's a football player, he's really tall, you know, his hair's in dreads, you know, he wears a starter jacket most of the time. Yeah, he's black. Okay, I'm interested in that kind of hesitation and that kind of struggle. I'm also interested in school-level struggles. Do we here talk about patterns in achievement that we have at this school in the faculty meeting? Do we talk about discipline patterns that are racial, and when and where? And I'm also interested in sort of big policy struggles. Do we have affirmative action that's a color-conscious kind of policy that takes race explicitly into account? Or do we have policy that is typically called colorblind policy? Now, in this book, I'm trying to make the argument that what actually is going on, in many cases, is not colorblindness at all, but what I'm calling colormuteness, which is the active act of deleting a race word from the way you talk. I'll make clear what I mean by this in just a minute. But what I'm trying to argue sort of writ larger with this book is that in schools and elsewhere, race talk matters. That the way we talk about race in schools is not just talk, and then we go act the rest of the time. But that how we talk in racial terms or how we don't talk in racial terms has real implications for how racial inequalities get reproduced, and also how we might intervene to dismantle them. So the findings that I'm talking about in this book are based on literally thousands and many, many feet of examples gathered through systematic ethnographic work looking seriously at everyday life. And this question of when did race labels pop up in everyday life, when did they disappear? In unprompted conversations with folks, in district documents, in happy hours, in classrooms, in empty hallways. And I decided to study this site where I myself had just finished teaching 10th grade. So Columbus High School in California City is the is the site for this work. Both of them, as you can imagine, are pseudonyms. Unfortunately, I found out too late in the game that California City is a real place in California. So it was too late, it was already literally going to press. So my apologies to folks in California City. But this was really a fascinating place to me because I was coming actually from Boston. I had grown up in Iowa, and I was coming to teach at Columbus with zero experience teaching, as many people showed up to Columbus with. And what I found interesting at the time, there were 6 groups that people called races. Filipinos, they said, about 30%. Latino, about 30%. Black, 20%. Chinese, 8%. Samoan, 8%. White, around 5% of the student body. Okay? Same 6 groups operating in the faculty, majority white faculty, but still a somewhat diverse faculty, but definitely majority white. So I called, in this book, all of those words races, because local people called them races. And I think that was because they were used in all kinds of struggles over equality and inequality. All right? And the connection between race labels and inequality systems is a very important story of the book. So that's why I call them races, like local folks do, as opposed to ethnicities, as opposed even to nationalities. We can talk more about that in the Q&A if you like. So in any case, I went to Columbus as an ethnographer. I wanted to figure out how did race matter here at this place where I had taught. And like most researchers, I set out to listen to people talk to me about race. Most of us listen to people talk when we do research, but few of us, I think too few, frame talk itself as a complicated action with patterns to it, with scripts to it. And when I started treating race talk that way, I started to notice these amazing patterns in when race labels were present, when people worried about them, and when they were absent from conversation. And I figured this out through comparing the use of race labels in many different settings. A person, for example, muttering to me in private about a racial disciplinary pattern, then going to a public faculty meeting and saying nothing at all about the pattern that he had mentioned to me in private, and talking only about bad students or trouble students, problem students. I made comparisons, for example, between the way a superintendent would write to a judge and the way that same superintendent would come to a school faculty and talk. So I was able to make claims, I am making claims in the book, that at certain moments when people are talking about certain topics with certain people, race labels vanish from conversation. I also had a lot of people talking to me about their race talk, I realized. And people saying in so many words often that they were deleting race words from public settings. So they would say, I would never say in public that we need to raise Latino graduation rates. I'd rather talk about graduation in general. Okay? Or shouldn't we talk about all students rather than programs for specific race groups or other groups of students? So I realized over listening to more and more people talk to me about their talking, that this question of how and when to talk about school life and school people in racial terms was an everyday struggle for people at Columbus. And again, the act of deletion is what I got most interested in, and it's what I came to call color muteness. When people actively resist, I would never talk in public about Latino graduation rates. I use this as opposed to color blindness because I think that color blindness implies falsely that people cannot see race. And I'm interested instead in people actively resisting race talk. And I think that people often resist race talk for very well-meaning reasons. Would it hurt kids? Would it make me sound like a racist? Would it highlight race in ways that wouldn't help this situation? Would it destroy relations with my colleagues? Would it destroy relations with my kids? But my own question about color muteness became, when is actively not talking in racial terms in schools itself a harmful thing? For example, how does silence about inequitable racial patterns allow those patterns to stand? How does maybe even resisting a race label, that person who says, well, he has his hair in dreads, he wears a blue starter jacket, how does that actually make race matter more? To delete that word so actively from talk. So I found that people were struggling in 6 basic ways with race labels at Columbus. And I want to do a quick and dirty job of telling you these 6 ways that they were struggling. Each chapter in the book, by the way, tackles a specific dilemma of race talk. That's how it's been set up. I want to just say, and I can say more about this in the Q&A, that I'm framing these dilemmas as American dilemmas for a bunch of reasons. One is that there was a very strange circumstance, American I mean shared by all of us in this room, A very unusual circumstance while I was at Columbus happened that convinced me that these patterns were somewhat shared, which is that the school got reconstituted in the middle of my research. And as you can imagine, as a researcher, as an anthropologist, suddenly your entire, quote, village vanishes from under your eyes. And it's a very strange situation for a researcher, right? But it was a fascinating research opportunity because a whole new faculty of strangers came in, 100 people from around the country, and they, over a very short amount of time, replicated the same exact patterns of when people talked and did not talk racially that had been there before. They also articulated to me in private the exact same dilemmas of worrying about talking racially that the people before them had had. So this, to me, helped me see these dilemmas as shared. I also frame them as shared despite the fact that different race groups, of course, have different experiences with race labels. People of color, of course, are labeled far more often than are white people with race labels in daily life. White people are often the most afraid to use race labels, even as we are the least often, we least often have them applied to us. We also share, as an American community, I think, the basic issue of when do we proceed in racial terms? When should we have color-conscious policies, colorblind ones? And also, a key argument of this book is that we share as a nation the racial inequalities that we most struggle to talk about. And the idea that those inequalities and the patterns, disparities, are shared is a key argument of this book. So that's why I'm trying with this book to get people to put these dilemmas right on the table and talk about them. I think if we get critically self-conscious, as opposed to just nervously self-conscious, of the ways that we talk and don't talk in racial terms in education, it can actually assist us to do racial equity work because we can navigate those dilemmas more knowingly. So, quick and dirty on the 6 dilemmas that I'm talking about. Can you put up that PowerPoint thing? I hate PowerPoint, but here it is. And I never produce graceful PowerPoints, but the basic thing is to have you see these dilemmas, okay? The first one, basic problem underlying all use of race labels. We don't belong to simple race groups, but we do. Race groups are biologically false, they're biologically bogus, but they've become socially real over centuries, and they're especially real when it comes to inequality. So to me, an everyday question actually in schools is, when is it accurate to use simple race labels to describe difference? We encounter this dilemma in schools when we think about, for example, the boxes we have our kids fill out when they enroll in schools. Are they too simple for the complex kids, especially kids considering themselves mixed? Too simple for kids to fill out. On the other hand, are simple racial boxes necessary for distributing resources? And this was the basic dilemma central to the controversy over the census categories a couple years ago, for example. We also encounter this dilemma, number one, in schools when we think about how do we design curriculum. Because often this sort of classic multicultural strategy is to have sequential units. We have 6 groups in my classroom, and so we're going to have 6 units. Okay? It works to sort of equitably represent everyone in the room. On the other hand, it blurs all kinds of complex identities. It blurs the mixed histories between those groups. Okay? So this dilemma, we don't belong to simple race groups, but we do, I think operates often in education. And a strategy which I have a separate article that I can talk about more, that I found that students were particularly graceful with in navigating this dilemma, was a strategy I'm calling race bending, which was sometimes to contest the very idea of race groups. I'm Filipino, I'm Samoan, I have a little black, etc. At other moments, especially when talking about inequality, to strategically use simple race labels. When's the Latino unit? Okay? So this is a strategy that I actually think is a graceful strategy. And adults are much more clumsy with this. We tend to talk as if one or the other is true. So, for example, when Gary Orfield's talking about, not to say he's clumsy, but when he's talking about resegregation, he doesn't waste any time talking about identities, about biologically bogus, mixed identities, right? Other people say race is biologically bogus. No longer are we going to talk about races. The very word is itself racist. Okay? I think especially the latter is a clumsy way of dealing with this dilemma. Okay, the second dilemma is figuring out how to talk successfully in schools about how race matters. especially when it comes to our social interactions. And I think there's a fundamental confusion in schools and in the nation about when race should matter to how we treat one another, how we even see one another. We often argue in this country that we shouldn't treat each other in racial terms. Of course, that is as we treat each other in racial terms constantly. So when my kids entered my room on the first day of school, the first thing I did was, when taking attendance, was write down racial labels, assumed racial labels next to their names, so I could remember which name went with which person. And indeed, my students wanted to be represented as race group members in my curriculum. They wanted the Latino unit. On the other hand, my students did not want to be treated as race group members when it came to moments of discipline, right? So in schools in America, we have a fundamental mixed personality about when we should treat each other as race group members. And so in our relations in school, and in how we talk about those relations, there's always this fundamental ambiguity, which is that race doesn't matter, but it does. And given the reality of ambiguity, we often, I think, react with oversimplification when we talk about race in schools. So we grab some social relations issues and talk about them like they're unequivocally racial. Other social issues we sort of sweep under the carpet like they're not racial at all. And at Columbus, the topic that got talked about as if it was unequivocally racial was how the kids got along. So that the principal would feel comfortable coming over the loudspeaker and saying, I want everybody to talk about the racial violence that occurred last night between the kids. We had a Latino Samoan riot last night. What was not comfortable for people at Columbus to talk about was how kids and adults got along in racial terms. And that topic was treated as in public talk as if it was not racial at all. So you would never imagine the principal coming over the loudspeaker at Columbus and saying, we need to talk about how the white teachers are getting along with their Latino kids, 15 minutes of discussion. This would never happen because in public, the discussion of discipline was specifically not racial. Race labels were absolutely absent from 3 years of being around Columbus at moments when people publicly discussed discipline. So one of the things I'm arguing here is that maybe rather than oversimplify this idea that the kids always are in race groups and they're always battling, and race is the absolutely most central issue to how they get along, versus race doesn't matter at all to how kids and adults get along, maybe we need to learn to debate how race does and doesn't matter to various social relations that we're having in our schools. All right, the next dilemma gets to how race should matter in the discourse of school reform. And in this case, this chapter talks a lot about the discourse of all students in education. It's a pervasive discourse. I argue in the chapter that it's a race-loaded phrase. It's often meant to stand for, let's make things racially equal here. But the dilemma is that the deraced words we use, and I'm calling all students a deraced word, when discussing plans for achieving racial equality can actually keep us from discussing ways to make opportunities racially equal. The problem I see is that all students become so dominant in education, and it gets us fired up in good ways to pursue equity work. It can often structure out talk of racial inequality. So the story at Columbus, just to make it very short, was that over many decades, the language of all students became absolutely pervasive in California City after a deseg law that originally was intended to improve opportunities for black students. So over several decades, all students became on posters, it was on mission statements, it was everywhere. In the 80s, the court said, we're kind of worried about black and Latino students. We're worried about their achievement in California City. And so they tried to add this back into the analysis. The problem was that all students' discourse was so pervasive in California City, when the superintendent would come to Columbus, for example, and say, you're under threat of reconstitution. Improve things for all students. The faculty would respond by saying, we're trying to improve things for all students. Okay? Even though the intent of reconstitution stemming from this deseg law was actually to improve things for black and Latino students. Columbus did get reconstituted, a whole new faculty came in, immediately started talking about all students. So an amazing replication in which a whole faculty got fired because of a law stemming from a concern for black and Latino students, replication of a whole group of 100 people and no analysis occurring throughout these 2 years of whether reforms existing or the new reform of reconstitution were in fact intended, were existing reforms were successful at serving Black and Latino students, or whether reconstitution was about serving those students. So I'm worried about the discourse of all students and when it works for us to achieve racial equality and when it can mask important conversations. Okay, I want to hurry it up here so we get to our panel. 4, the more complex inequality seems to get, the more simplistic inequality analysis seems to become. What I mean by this is the more complicated demographics get in our schools and in our districts, they're getting incredibly complicated at this point. We have schools and districts with hundreds of language groups. We have race patterns within class patterns within race patterns. Columbus was a very complicated demographically school. What I worry about is that it becomes very hard to figure out who is disadvantaged in comparison to whom, and how so. We spend a lot of time arguing over whether we should target specific groups for assistance. And because of this arguing, we often, instead of doing the complicated analysis we need to do of opportunity and of student needs, we often replace that complicated analysis with the most simplistic terms for talking about our kids and their needs. So Columbus talked only about their kids as a unit of at-risk kids. In the process, often masking certain issues of internal need. Do Black and Latino students need specific services, extra services? What about English language learners? Okay, so at the university level, people similarly complex demographics in California, replacing race-based affirmative action with policies to assist the vaguest category of all, the disadvantaged. Okay, so I'm interested in the more complex our inequalities get. Do we replace this complex analysis we need to do with simple, simplistic terms? Okay, the questions we ask most about race and education are the very questions we most suppress. What I'm interested in this chapter is the basic question of, do racial patterns in achievement exist and why? To me, this is one of the most often asked, relentlessly asked, in fact, questions of educational research. The superintendent asked it and talked about it with a judge. Teachers at Columbus were muttering that very question in private. But when these various actors got together to actually discuss how to improve things, achievement was never discussed as a racial issue. Okay? So similarly, when the superintendent would come to talk to Columbus teachers, never would he mention a concern for Black and Latino students. Okay? So I'm interested in a couple things. Why we suppress this question, and also how we screw up when we ask the question about race and achievement, and how we screw up when we don't ask the question of race and achievement. I'm very concerned in this chapter about dynamics of blame when we do talk about why patterns, racial achievement patterns exist. I'm also concerned, though, about the consequences of not talking about racial achievement patterns and how both of those acts, in fact, can normalize and naturalize racial achievement patterns themselves. As opposed to what I'm interested in forging is an urgent language of communal responsibility. How can we talk well about racial achievement patterns, as opposed to asking in ways that blame isolated groups, kids, teachers, race groups, or suppressing the question itself of do racial patterns in achievement exist here and why? So how do we talk well about racial achievement gaps is the question of that chapter. And finally, the most basic sort of paradox of color muteness. Although talking in racial terms can make race matter, not talking in racial terms can make race matter too. What I'm interested in here is that when we don't talk about patterns that we quietly think are racial, we can make race seem even more relevant to those patterns. Okay? So I won't talk about this one that much, but I just want to mention this last chapter is all about people talking and not talking about the hallway and who was wandering around in the hallway in racial terms. And in private, people muttered over and over and over again that Black kids are disproportionately represented in the hallways. Then they would say in so many words, I would never say such a thing in public. That would be discriminatory. Okay? What I'm interested in is how it can actually be, for the one thing, discriminatory to not mention a disproportion in who's wandering around in the halls, and also about how people muttering quietly about the black kid's in the hall, the black is in the hall, how that often displaces analysis just onto the black kids and their blackness, as opposed to the many actors producing a racial pattern where black kids were overrepresented in the Columbus hallway. So I'm interested here in how quietly only talking in racial terms, not talking more openly about a racial disparity where black kids were in fact missing classes disproportionately, allowed often to wander for hours, untouched, how that actually, not talking in racial terms, can make race matter too. Okay? By displacing analysis onto those kids, as particularly problematic kids at Columbus, who can't be talked about. Okay? So these are the dilemmas. Now what I want to do is open it up to our panel, like I said, who was I'm very grateful to these folks for reading this book. And I want us to just open it up with a basic question, which is, have you experienced any of the race talk dilemmas that I've described in this book? And any insights or questions the book has raised for you about race talk in education? So there it is. Eileen, can you start us off?
Sure.
Okay.
My name's Eileen Shakespeare, once again. And I've been teaching in the Boston Public Schools for 33 years. And I think I've been saying 33 years for about 5 years. I really have to figure out how many years it really is. But anyway, I want to just offer you a couple of stories that are related to the book and some questions that the book raised for me. One is that I did write this chapter called What I'd Tell a White Gal, which was teacher-based research with my young black male students about what were their relationships like with their white female teachers, and could any of that inform me as a practitioner to make me give better service to young black men. And so I wrote this chapter, and it's in a book, and somebody read it. So I thought, oh, that's good. So the Urban Seminar here read it about 5 years ago, and I was invited to speak to the class. And there were probably about 20 people in the room, all of whom were placed in urban schools. And there were in the group maybe 6 or 7 young black men. And I came in kind of nervously, kind of bravely, like, yes, I've written this book, and now everybody's going to tell me how wrong I am. And I'm really going to get into trouble, but I'm going to be brave, because you have to start talking about these things. And sure enough, I finished my short introduction, and a bunch of hands went up, because everybody had read the chapter, and I thought, okay, here it comes, And the first person called on was a young black man, and he said, I'm at English high school, and I'm teaching Shakespeare, and my kids don't do their homework. I was like, wait a second. So it's kind of an odd story to open with, because I came prepared to do race talk, and what was on this person's mind was much more school issues. So my experience of being brave and putting my work out there actually ended up being a great class, but not really about that. So it's kind of odd experience. Anyway, the other story I wanted to mention to you was something that happened to me very early in my teaching career, probably 72 or 73, when I was sitting talking with a bunch of kids, and one of my students, a Cape Verdean boy, middle school boy, said, and a really kind of mild-mannered kid turned to another kid in the class and said, I'm going to wipe that white right off your face. And it was the first time I really had ever thought about whiteness as something concrete that someone else would perceive as separate from your very being. And I probably was the first time as a young woman, a 22-year-old woman, that I really started to think about my whiteness as being something that someone else would notice at all. So I think that's kind of remarkable that I could get that far without thinking about that, noticing that. And as a teacher, it's pretty dangerous and pretty damaging to be starting as a teacher and to be so unaware. And I think happily, there's a generational change that people are somewhat more better educated about that. But experientially, I'm not sure that people are better prepared. So that second story is about the question of whiteness and why whiteness is something that people are reluctant to bring into the discussion. And towards the end of the book, she brings up how white people don't really want to mention that their whiteness may be part of the problem or may be problematic in any way. So that made me think, why don't white people want to identify their whiteness as problematic for kids, period? Or just even think about it with their students, with their fellow teachers. And I have some speculation about that, and I think some of it has to do with just generations of deep kind of confusing guilt about our histories, and also a somewhat that it's not in white people's self-interest to bring their whiteness as problematic into the discussion. And that's pretty powerful motivation to not have to open the discussion about it. We get a lot because of our whiteness. And if you go all the way with the equation, then you have to give up some. And I think historically it's not easy for groups that have advantage and have privilege to give that up. So even those of us who work every day in environments where it really matters who we are and how we relate to our kids, I think sometimes we're still reluctant to open that up. And lastly, the book raised for me something I've been thinking about for a long time, and that's that there's almost no intellectuality in the discussion that you see between teachers and kids in this book. The discussions that are related are almost all about behavior, discipline. I can't recall a conversation that was, I was teaching Shakespeare, I was teaching The Great Migration, and this kid said this, and then this kid said that. And so I thought, wow, this is a school. It's supposed to be a place that develops kids intellectually, and yet I don't see any casual conversation, corridor conversation about intellectual things. So that made me think, okay, where did the stereotype that black men are not school people, are not intellectual people, don't have, the kind of interest in natural inclination towards intellectual work. Where did that come from? And when my experience is so evident that there is such a strong tradition among young black men, or black men in general, of intellectuality. So how did we get this very irrational stereotype? So that also really saddened me how little intellectual conversation went on between students and teachers. And that made me think about what is the image of the young black man in the corridor? Is the image someone you could say, hey, did you see that thing on the news last night? And remember we were studying that in class? And that wasn't the inclination of the teachers. It was more like a cheery, good morning, even though the kid was cutting class, or a discipline thing. So that raised for me the question, where did that stereotype come from, that young black men don't want to be intellectual and don't want to do school? So that's me.
Good evening. I was on my way out of school today, and a teacher came by the office, and she said, Mr. Guerrero, you're leaving early today. She said, I thought Fridays was the night you had dinner with your family. I said, yes, that's true, but tonight I'm going to be participating in a special talk. What are you going to be discussing? We're going to be talking about race. Oh. Well, you know me. I don't care if they're green, red, yellow, I do the same thing. I do my thing all the time. And I kind of walked out there to the parking lot thinking to myself, can we be successful in our mission to meet the needs of a diversity of learners if we give them all the same thing? If we are mute to color, if we are mute to language needs, if we are mute to special needs. In Chapter 5, Mica says, schools are institutions saturated with blame. Descriptions of any achievement patterns immediately prompts an explanation. Who's to blame for it? Largely a question of accountability. Right now, the Massachusetts State Department of Education, right now they're holding the Dever Elementary largely responsible for the underachievement at our school. I want to start with a little bit of demographics of the particular school setting that I'm working in right now. Having come to the school 2 Septembers ago, came to a school, large elementary school in the Boston Public Schools, serving just under 550 students, mainly from the Dorchester area. Most of them are bused. Although it's interesting to me every morning because there's about 5 large busloads of kids from across the street who go elsewhere. We host a number of programs in our building. We serve about a third of our population are second language learners. We have a number of programs that serve students with special needs. Racial background, about 45% of our students are African American, about 45% of our students are Hispanic Latino, and about 10% are Vietnamese and a handful of white students. In contrast, of our 40 teachers, 18% are black, 10% are Hispanic, and 70% are white. The Dever is a school that happens to have, at this point, a large percentage of students with identified special needs and the plans that come with those. Over 100 students. That's over 20% of our students in our school. The interesting thing is that in our school we host a number of substantially separate special needs classes. These are for students with severe emotional disabilities, behavioral disabilities. Of the 50 students or so that sit in seats in these classrooms, or try to sit in seats in these classrooms, 95% of them are African American. About the same percentage of them are male. I want to go back to the accountability piece. The Dever Elementary, as I found it, was one under an increasingly more stringent standards-based environment. In compliance with No Child Left Behind, schools are under an extreme amount of pressure to meet a number of goals as measured in proficiencies that schools are expected to meet. The school for 4 years, not only had it not been meeting incrementally, making goals towards making sure all students by 2014 were proficient in subject areas, in fact, it had been declining for 4 years. And that prompted a visit by the State Department just recently, actually coming out to the school to see what was going on. Is there some kind of a plan in place? Are there conditions existing in the school such that improvement seems likely? Fortunately for now, they answered in the affirmative to both those questions. And that's largely based, I think, on the school community looking much more critically via the process of developing a whole school improvement plan over the last year, where we are asked to look much more critically at the academic achievement patterns of not just the category all students, as in school average, but to also look at each of the subgroups. And so in looking at how our African American students are doing, in looking at how our ELL, English Language Learner students are doing, and in looking at how our special needs students are doing, the disparities are there. The disparities are there not just in comparison to the state average in Massachusetts for, say, a 4th grader in math or a 5th grader in science, but the disparities exist within our school. Black to Latino, special needs to white, et cetera, et cetera. And so beginning to have a reflective conversation about why that is. And I know there's quite a bit, Mica speaks quite a bit about those achievement patterns and how teachers begin to assess why it is. Why is it? If, as the teacher said, they all get the same thing, why is it that we are not producing then the same outcomes? So it's an interesting question. As we begin now more critically, more reflectively talk about, obviously the same thing isn't working. It isn't working for all our students, and it isn't working in particular for a number of the subgroups. And so what do we need to do differently? Examining our own teaching practices, examining what kind of strategies perhaps may be more successful to those students for whom English isn't a first language, to those students for whom require teacher to differentiate their instruction in such a way that they might have more success with the students that are in front of them. So this question of accountability is interesting because it really asks us to look at ourselves as a school under this pressure of making sure that, and the question that I'm really interested in is, can we provide this sense of school efficacy for all of those students that walk in our door? That's the Dever Elementary right now.
Okay, I'm going to talk from a couple of different perspectives. I'm going to start out with a sort of systemic perspective and then move down to the teacher perspective and end with a teacher and student comparison. But before I do that, I want to say that Mica's book is a phenomenal book and that it's on sale outside. I know I was going to say this, but in case you have to leave early, make sure you pick up a copy because it's really well written and really interesting and engaging and practical and hard and frustrating and all the kinds of things that a good book should be. So that being said, I will start, as I said, with the systemic level, because one of the things that Mica does really well in this book is she shows you how these 6 dilemmas that she has up here play out at a number of different levels. At a systemic level among adults, administrators, teachers, etc., between students, among students, between students and teachers, at all in court documents and how it plays out and so forth. And so I thought I would sort of talk about these various levels. I was in Dearborn, Michigan 2 weeks ago conducting interviews for the book that I'm writing in a high school that's 95% Arab American. And Dearborn is the highest concentration of Arab Americans in the United States, and the school district is something over 50% Arab American, but nobody knows what percent over. And there's a couple reasons for this. First of all, Arab Americans are considered to be white. And so if you look at the demographics, say on greatschools.net, the Fordson High School is 98% white. And that's something that's frustrating. Another thing is, though, that as a school board member told me, a school board member who herself is not Arab American, because right now there are no Arab American school board members, but who considers herself to be, and is I think also considered by the Arab American community, whatever that means, to be an ally. She herself told me that they no longer count how many Arab Americans, what the percentage of Arab Americans is in the school district, because they are concerned that the wealthier white non-Arab Americans who live in West Dearborn, if they discover what percentage of their property taxes are going to go educate the poorer Arab Americans, will then in fact not approve school bond issues and so forth. So when the numbers approached 60%, the Dearborn Public Schools stopped counting, which I thought was really fascinating. When I was there a couple weeks before, there had been an extremely contentious school board meeting where the school board rejected, for the first time in its history, a recommendation from the school naming committee for what to name a new school. The school naming committee had proposed naming it after an Arab American community activist who was beloved basically across the city. And the claim was angrily that this was not because they were rejecting an Arab American. There are no schools right now in Dearborn named after Arab Americans. And so I came, and there was all this hoopla. I was hearing about it from all sides. And I read an article in the plane on the way back that immediately made me think of Mica's book, because it was an interview in the Arab American News with the superintendent of Dearborn, who is white, non-Arab American, where the reporter from the Arab American News is asking a series of extremely provocative questions about, why this school naming debacle happened, what side he was going to take, et cetera. And he said, this racial issue, this racial conflict, and the superintendent shot back angrily, I don't know what you're talking about, a racial conflict. You and I are both the same race. You and I are both white. And it totally, I mean, it's not that it missed the point. The superintendent knew exactly what the point was, just like the reporter knew exactly what the point was. But it was a really interesting use of race talk to deflect what was actually going on. And it was also interesting that the Arab American reporter used race talk in terms of talking about racial conflict as a way of trying to provoke the superintendent to answer specifically the questions he was asking. Because he moved to race talk, he moved to calling it racial conflict only after he had asked a couple questions specifically about Arab Americans and their place in the community, and had gotten essentially stonewalling from the superintendent. So I thought that was a really interesting, right? And then the one other example, and this is all sort of in the systemic thing, is that when I was talking to the school board members and to some of the teachers, they're redistricting because of this new school, this unnamed new school. And one of the redistricting plans was shot down because the concern was that it was going to send Sunni and Shiite Muslims to the same school, to the same elementary school. And I was stunned that that was given, people talked about it as a smart thing to think about, and people also talked about it as a veil. Some of the people who were upset over the redistricting said that this was merely being used as an excuse. But nobody talked about it as being an illegitimate thing to be concerned about, or something to be concerned about because it might be a concern, but then something for the school district proactively to work on. Whereas, for example, I don't think that if we were redistricting here in Boston, which we are doing right now, there's lots of conversation over diversity. But nobody says, one good thing about going back to neighborhood schools is that there will be fewer racial conflicts because the schools will be less diverse. They do say going back to neighborhood schools would be a good thing, community empowerment, community involvement. Yes, diversity may go down, but it will be, will give ownership to all of it. There's lots of stuff going on in Boston right now about why we might not want to pursue policies that will lead to maximal diversity in the schools, but the language is never, say, to avoid the kinds of racial comparisons or conflicts, which I thought was interesting that people did feel, at least in Dearborn, comfortable making when it wasn't talking essentially about black-white or black-white Latino. So that's sort of issues that resonated with me just having dropped into Dearborn a couple weeks ago and thinking about Mica's book. From the teacher perspective, a couple years ago when I was teaching at the McCormick Middle School in Dorchester, from which I'm currently on leave and going back to teaching this fall, I was co-chairing a committee on the achievement gap. And we were, looking at our numbers and trying to figure out, just like Guadalupe was talking about, trying to figure out who was doing well, who was doing poorly, et cetera. One of the challenges we had is that our best performing students were other. And they were other because they were Cape Verdean. And our Cape Verdean students, despite Cape Verde's being a country, an island off the coast of Africa and being considered part of Africa, and despite the majority of our Cape Verdean students being American citizens, they don't consider themselves to be African American. For some very good reasons. Mary Waters writes about this, I think, really well. And there's certain ways in which they fear that they may be pulled down in terms of achievement if they identify or if they are identified too closely as African Americans. Now, the school district does identify them as African Americans in terms of our official numbers, but they don't. And so this was one of these dilemmas that we were dealing with in our Achievement Gap Committee. Another dilemma that we were dealing with was that our Latino students were doing the worst. Our bilingual students were doing the very worst, and right above that were our Latino students who were not in bilingual classes, and some of whom who had never been in bilingual classes. And so our committee, which was carefully composed of teachers from all racial groups in the school, was debating this, and we kept coming back, the teachers kept coming back to saying, well, the parents are working 2 jobs. And I'd say, well, our black kids and our Dominican kids really are as poor. This is not what's really going on here. And they'd say, well, it's a language problem. I'd say, well, but our Cape Verdean kids and our Vietnamese kids, they're coming from homes that don't speak English at home. That can't be the whole problem either. And this issue kept coming up of there wanting to be answers that could be placed on the family or placed on the community or ascribed to class or ascribed to culture of origin. And never was the committee comfortable talking about whether or not we treated students differentially. Now, I don't know that was the problem either. It may not be. And our bilingual, now our sheltered English immersion program, it is, I think, a really wonderful program in the school. I think that they did an incredible amount to lift up our students. But we never talked about, say, whether our non-bilingual teachers maybe treated students differently. That was something that we really didn't feel that we could touch. And having read Mica's book, it makes me more aware that we didn't touch it, and still just as sort of frustrated, trying to figure out, well, how would I try to do it? Once I go back, if we're still batting this question about, as I'm sure we will be, because I don't have the impression that we've done much in the last 2 years to resolve it, how would I structure our conversation differently? My last set of examples or issues that relate to these 6 dilemmas that Mica brings up relate to the interaction between teachers and students. And this is where I thought that some of Mica's work was most interesting in thinking about the ways in which teachers steadfastly, and adults in general, steadfastly avoid racializing themselves in their relationship to students. And where her points about students' creativity in the use of race, I thought, was also the most well taken. I taught in Atlanta initially, in an all-African-American school with a predominantly African-American faculty and staff, and their race was talked about all the time. And that's where I learned to talk about race, essentially. I learned to be relatively unself-conscious, bringing up race in either same race or mixed race settings in a way that I think, well, certainly I, as a white person, had not learned to do in previous settings, which were, predominantly white. And I moved to Boston in a very diverse school. And I was determined, one of the things that I had decided in my 3 years in Atlanta, and before as well, but especially provoked by Atlanta, was that we all needed to learn to talk about race a lot better. That this was I thought this was one of the keys to the United States' continuing problem with race, was that we don't talk about it enough and we don't talk about it comfortably, especially across racial groups. So I came in as this crusading teacher to do that. And my students the first year were really appalled at how much I brought it up. They were, I think in part they felt sort of challenged and as if I was racializing them in ways that they didn't want to be, even when I was trying not to. Also, I was confused that first year because I didn't understand. I taught in an all African-American school where everybody had grown up in the neighborhood, their parents had grown up in the neighborhood, their grandparents may have been part of the Great Migration North and then come back down south, but nobody was from outside the United States for generations. And I walked into a classroom that apparently was 50% African-American, but was in fact Dominican and Cape Verdean and Jamaican and Haitian, and they certainly, very few identified as African-American. And I was just totally out of my league and that may have also been the problem for the first year. But that crusading approach didn't quite work in this mixed classroom, and potentially maybe from a white teacher. It may have been that it would have worked better from another teacher. I was interested, though, my students, both in Atlanta and in Boston, as I became part of the furniture, I became sort of an honorary non-white. And the very few white students in our school, also, if they were cool, they became honorary non-white. So the only Jewish student that I've taught in Boston, at least that I know is Jewish, was actually, oh, no, she's all right, she's black. She lived in Dorchester, she lives in Fields Corner, and she was really cool. And she was publicly acknowledged by students to be black, and she accepted that designation, even though it was an implicit, total slam on her being white. Because it was basically the way for her to be cool was not to be white. And I was really interested that nobody really ever challenged that as being itself racist or problematic. And I became sometimes cool and not really white. I was okay. I'm going to end with an example of how this dilemma is now playing out as I'm anticipating going back to teaching. In my 2 years off, having read Mica's book along with a whole lot else, and started thinking about issues of stereotype threat, which Mica doesn't talk about a lot in this book, but being introduced to the work of Claude Steele and thinking with that plus Mica's work about how especially we talk with students about race. I'm sort of in the throes of a dilemma. In the past, say when I've had the young black male, to go back to one of the images that we've been dealing with so far, who's been off the rails, not working well, but who's clearly smart, I and an African-American colleague of mine, the 8th grade science teacher, have sat him down and had a serious conversation with him about how he has options ahead of him. He can be sort of the shining light role model, young African-American male, that if he does well in school, he has so many opportunities because there are so few of them that do, and he can be a role model for all, or he can fulfill expectations and end up in juvenile detention. And for some of our students, it's very clear that that's the option they're deciding between. And that was always a conversation that I felt a little uncomfortable having, but I had this African-American colleague with me, and it was also really clear for many of these students that they had really two pretty bifurcated choices in front of them. They didn't have the option, say, to go along being marginal their whole time. There were too many other things pulling them away from marginality into real delinquency. But they also had incredible intelligence and promise, and we were hoping to pull them into real achievement. I don't know anymore how to deal with that kind of, how to race talk that through. When I'm dealing with a young African-American or Latino or Vietnamese, especially African-American student, and especially male, who's clearly trying to make this choice between, say, the gang that they've been involved in and trying to make it to Latin. I'm not sure how much to invoke racial stereotypes with them or not. They're aware of them. They will talk about a quarter of African-American men are in prison or involved in the criminal justice system. They'll bring that up, so it's not as if I can pretend to be ignorant of the possibility. But on the other hand, I'm not sure how much I make myself part of that engine by raising those things. And so that's one of the race talk dilemmas that I currently am anticipating becoming involved with again as I go back to teaching that I'm grappling with. I'll hand it over.
I'm Janie Ward, and I would like to first thank Mica for a really lovely read. I so appreciated the care with which you approached the subject and sort of gave us a way of thinking about this very complex issue of dilemmas of speaking racially, and gave us ways to think about the everyday politics and patterns of talking racially. As an African-American woman, I talk about race a lot, and I was raised to talk about race. And I'm going to speak for all 26 million black folks right now and say that we have always had to talk about race. Race talk among black folks has always been seen as a necessary response to the oppressive forces of racism. Our very survival has depended on these conversations. And as such, over the many centuries that we've been on these shores, I think that we have developed a very rich repertoire of ways to do race talk. Sometimes we use humor, but at the same time we could also be very serious and very scholarly. Sometimes we use metaphor, or we tell stories and folk tales or proverbs. And when we run out of words, we sing about it. And then when we're tired of singing, we dance on it. Look at Alvin Ailey. So there are any number of forms of expressive behavior that black folks have adopted over the years to talk about race. So when I did my research, in which I was interested in racial socialization in African American families, and I went around the country talking to black parents who were parenting adolescents and asking them very simply, what do you say to your kids about race? I got back, hundreds of stories of parents saying, well, this is what I said, and this is how I said it that time, and it was different when I was talking to them about a school-related issue versus when I was talking about a community, a very rich repertoire of all of this stuff. So once the book was published and I went out and started talking to school folks and sharing what I had learned, on more than a few occasions, I would start my book talk and just launch right in talking about race, and I swear it would be like deers caught in headlights. That she's coming in and she's talking about race, and she's naming it, and she's, giving us these stories. And so what Mica had asked us to do was to just kind of jot down some ideas that came to us while we were reading. And so I just want to share with you a few experiences that have come from either my own personal experiences with book talks and things that I've either observed or have been shared with me, or my own research now at the Ed School, in which we are talking to teachers and others about race and gender issues. And I'll start with a book talk that I did in Brookline, and I was talking about the patterns of inequality that put black kids at risk, and I was talking about how black children, we were always told that as blacks we got to jump twice as high, run twice as fast, and work twice as hard to be considered half as good. And a white male teacher in the audience during the Q&A said, well, that's really interesting, but I couldn't possibly say those things. And I said, oh, why? He said, I couldn't say that to a black child. It's not my place. Another thing that I jotted down, which has been mentioned, but I want to share with you what it feels like from a black perspective. And that is when somebody white is talking at about this voice level, and suddenly they get to the word black. And then I have to, what? As if the use of the race label is in itself inherently racist. I have heard teachers in our research group who say, I don't see color. My students are all the same. And in so doing, sort of take the moral high ground and suggest that people who do see color, there's something wrong with them for noticing these differences. I have heard white teachers say that they can't or shouldn't criticize black kids, even when black kids are flagrantly misbehaving, because, well, they're not going to listen to you. Well, that might be true. Or, who am I to say? Maybe that's the way they act at home or in their community. Or, if I were to criticize them, they may not like me anymore. How about the use of proxies? And Mica had mentioned them, that at-risk category. What does that mean? Or one of my favorites that I often hear among my own faculty. Let's talk about diversity. Oh, and let's keep the conversation so broad, so general, that we never get anywhere near talking about what we really need to talk about. Mira, I thank you so much for talking about race, and perhaps, as you said, it might be sort of a clumsy way, but just kind of bringing it into the classroom, because I get very tired of the fact that the onus is always placed on black folks to talk about race. It's like, well, let's wait until the black person brings it up. And what's that all about? I do want to share with you one very powerful moment that I was reminded of this morning in looking through our data and Project Assert. And this came from a white female teacher in which she was explaining that she grew up in the South. We were talking about the N-word and the fact that in this school, urban school, Boston Public School, high school, the N-word is thrown around just a bit too much. And this is a school that often talks about incivility and a lack of respect among kids. And youth language use is very much at the heart of it, as is the use of the N-word. And the teacher said that she had heard it one day too many times. And she said to the students, do you know what that's like for me as a white woman who grew up in the South to hear you use those words? And she said after she had that discussion with them, the word was never used in her class. A very powerful moment in which she was able to talk about her own racial identity and its intersection with gender, bring it into the classroom, and truly transform what was going on in the classroom. We don't have to always be afraid of our race conversations. We don't have to always assume that they're going to devolve into, fighting and scratching and yelling and hating and all that other kind of stuff. And the last thing I would leave with you is that I very much worry about the silence and the injurious nature of silence to the education and the psychosocial development of black children. And, and I think that I need to put this into historical perspective. For centuries, there has been an insidious assault on the psychological value of African human beingness. And this translates to a mental assault on African people that has resulted in a worldwide perception and treatment of African people as inferior and less than human. And how that plays itself out is that our children are systematically told that they are intellectually inferior, that there's something wrong with our thinking, our perceptions, our reasoning abilities. And this idea of being color mute fits right into it. So that the black child who's sitting around experiencing inequality left and right, and is in an environment in which people are basically saying, there's no equality. I don't know what's the matter with you. Your perception must be off. Cognitively, something ain't right. Children need to have their experiences affirmed. We need to have adults there who are saying, you know, the way you're looking at the world, it makes a lot of sense. And by being mute, I fear we are causing real damage. And I think that truth-telling and resistance, truth-telling is an act of resistance to this perception, breaking the silence, talking about race in whatever ways that we can. Perhaps they are clumsy. Perhaps they are incomplete. But at least they are a beginning. And that's what I encourage us all to think about how best to do.
I'm scared to go now. No, I'm just going to add a few things because a lot of issues have already been raised. But I think this idea of color muteness as opposed to color blindness gives us a new way to talk and to take responsibility for not talking. In particular, I'm interested in white teachers who choose to work with students of color. Black students is where my research is pitched. But I think there is a whole segment of white liberal progressives who are out there, well-intentioned, without the right number of tools and the right kind of experiences and practices. Eileen attested to at 22, just sort of walking into this. As Miera attested to, you sort of get to it later in life. And because we don't have the conversations, either as professionals or in our personal, interpersonal experiences, we are very clumsy. We could do better. We have a responsibility to do better if we're going to place ourselves in a context that might be different from how we were raised. One strategy that I think the book always reminds me of is the ability to de-race or take the race labels out by using the class race debate, which I see a lot in my teaching fellow work here. I think that's just an important distinction that sometimes we like to blur those lines. It's easier to talk about class, or we substitute them in, or we use the at-risk disadvantage labeling all the time. Thank you, Eileen and Miera, again, for talking a little bit about white privilege and racism and the easy slide towards honorary non-white status. This is a theme in the work that I do, is that often because the kids are so creative in using race terms and blending and bending race categories, we don't have to talk about white privilege or oppression or racism because we get the honorary, not we, because I'm black, but white teachers and even middle-class folk get the honorary status that allows us to ignore the inequality in front of us. And while I would give some benefit to standards-based and this disaggregated data that's coming into our schools from the reforms that forces us to look at inequality in terms of achievement by racial groups, often we begin there and we end up in a conversation about just good teaching. And that's the final point that I'll make because I want us to have some time, is that this question of whether there is such a thing as a racialized pedagogy is always at odds with our inability to grasp or to just hold and agree with simple cultural explanations and the problem with simple race groups, right? Is there a best way to teach all the Asian students? Do we really know enough? Can we really reduce people to that construct, especially since it's always changing? And so if I end up with a racial achievement pattern where all the Asian students, or even more specific, the Vietnamese students are at the bottom, can I create a pedagogy that speaks specifically to them, and how do I name it? And how does it link to racial identity or racial labels? Really problematic stuff that we need to be adept and specific about what we're talking about, and we need to take responsibility for the oppression and racism that exists, that we all are a part of. And so I think sometimes that guilt gets in the way. So I'm stopping there.
Okay, great. I want to open it up to you guys to ask questions, but I just want to flag one thing first, which is that I think what everyone has shown here on the panel, and thank you so much for your insights, is the point is not to simply, it's a very important thing to me to make sure people in the room get, that the point is not just to talk more, but to talk more skillfully about race. And I think one thing that this book is trying to do is to have a tone of communal struggle with these dilemmas. And that's the tone that everyone on this panel, I think, has presented, is one of acknowledging that race talk is difficult, that we screw it up, and that if we talk about our dilemmas in so many words, it actually assists us to think through how to navigate them. So each person here has, I don't need to really go over them, but has articulated a different dilemma. When do we use the word white? When does it help to use the word white? How do we talk well about that 95% black male pattern in special ed? How do you actually talk about that well, not just more? Okay? How do we talk about a racial achievement gap in a way that actually includes all the necessary players, including ourselves, the ones talking? How do we talk not just more, but more skillfully? When do we use the word black itself as an evaluation? How can black itself be brought into conversations in ways that doesn't do the kind of damage that Janie is talking about, so that people don't take chapter 6 and say, talk more about the black kids, right? How do we actually talk skillfully? And finally, when does race enter our conversation about teaching well? When we're training students to be good teachers, for example. Important dilemmas that each one of you has raised and put on the table. So I'd like to invite you now, we have 20 minutes, to ask us questions or pose dilemmas that you yourself have faced that we can respond to in that spirit of communal struggle.
You should know that people should go to the microphone since this is being recorded.
Oh yeah, if you don't mind going to the microphone, that would be great.
While you're deciding who's going to go first, I just want to say Happy Cinco de Mayo. I was thinking of this little act of defiance by the substitute teacher we kicked out the front door of the school a few days ago for making some racist remarks to a mainly black kindergarten class. I know my rights as a white male. We all kind of scratched our head. I didn't quite get it, but.
Hi. Most of you all know me. I'm Dorinda Carter. My question is around the label race talk. And given that our schools are so diverse and that black includes Jamaican, Trinidadian, all these different groups. So now we have what I would consider ethnicity talk. And this dilemma of kids being lumped in a racial category when their ethnic background is very important to them. And a lot of times students would rather be referred to as Haitian and not black or not African American. So I'm just wondering how you would respond to that as an added layer to what is race talk, that ethnicity is embedded within that. And how educators deal with that, and teachers and policymakers, and so forth.
Okay. You were leaning forward. Did you want to respond?
Sure, I'll be happy to field that partly. Because this was a really explicit thing that I had to learn my first year teaching here in Boston. Because I had taught in this African American school in Atlanta that was so homogeneous. And so when I came to Boston and was told that 50% of my students were black and 30% Hispanic and 15% white and 5% Asian, I thought, okay. And I remember in October of my first year, I had 4 students after school for detention. And they all wanted to go to the bathroom because they all wanted to get out of detention for 5 minutes. And so I said, okay, you can go one at a time. And I made my list. And the 4th student on the list, the bottom student, said, hey, Dr. Levinson, that ain't fair. You're just being racist. And I said, huh? These were 4 African-American students as far as I was aware. He said, the first student is Dominican, and then you have the Cape Verdean, and then you have the 2 black kids. And I was just floored. Asa was a student who used race talk quite belligerently, not necessarily successfully, but at least aggressively over time. So this was not the first or the last time this came up. But as I said, I really had to learn who was comfortable with being thought of as being black, who wasn't. And what I'm still struggling with, actually, this is something I'm writing about in my book and that I'm struggling with for next year, is to what extent you say, okay, I'm going to go with your self-definition and I'm going to respect your sense of identity and your sense of personhood, and to what extent you also challenge that exclusionary identity. Part of what it means to be Cape Verdean and deny that you're black is itself, at best, it's acknowledging the racism of others and not wanting to be subject to it. At worst, it's racist. I mean, there are certainly some students who don't want to be known as blacks because black kids aren't smart. And they're not the good kids, and they're not the kids who are headed to college, and they're the kids, and I've had African American kids say to me, well, there's never going to be an African American president, they're too lazy, or we're too lazy. And so, in some part, you have African American kids who will say they're African American buying into this racism. You also have students who are phenotypically black, and who say outside of Boston, where there just aren't as many Cape Verdeans, say outside of Massachusetts, they're going to be seen as black by everybody who encounters them. And so they need to be prepared. I mean, this is one of the things I'm struggling with. My Cape Verdean students, if they go outside of Massachusetts, have to be prepared to be seen as black. In Boston, enough of us who, say, interact with the Cape Verdean community have learned that they're not black. But, if they go to Texas, they're going to be black. And so they have to have the wherewithal themselves to deal with that, to deal with being seen as black. And also they need to engage with to what extent are they rejecting the black label because it's too umbrella-like. To what extent are they rejecting it because they fear being lumped in as black by non-black racists? To what extent do they fear being seen as black because they're fearful of being treated by black racists as being, something worse? And to what extent is this the sort of racism of, gee, we have this one drop of Portuguese blood, and hence we're going to consider ourselves Portuguese, which is equally racist as the United States one drop of black blood makes you black. And so...
But now, do you think that teenagers could engage in that complicated, complex social analysis?
I think they could if we had the space to do it. I mean, this gets us back to standards and assessment and accountability and the rest of it. I mean, I think, could one structure, a really thoughtful, carefully planned unit that allowed, that built things up so that students could have those conversations? Yes. Could we do it having, 3 days to do it? Pulling it out of time for other curriculum? I'm not so sure.
This is the race-bending concept that I talked about in Chapter 1. And the idea there is that kids are actually already having many of these sophisticated arguments about race, ethnicity, Cape Verdean, black, and that it's actually adults often in schools who don't make the space to allow such complicated race talk to happen. I mean, what I wanted to just, in terms of Dorinda's comment also, is to mention is what you're flagging, I think, and also what Mayura is flagging, is that that race is itself about hierarchy, about ranking, about sort of hierarchy and ranking. That's what race has always been about. And that if you see here in Columbus, 6 groups called races. Samoan was called a race. Latino was called a race. Filipino called a race. And to me, they were called races by kids and even by the district statistics, which call them racial/ethnic, and it's sort of, they kind of sneaked away by calling it that. But I think they were called races not because people were stupid and didn't know the difference between race and ethnicity, but rather because those 6 groups were actually always jostling in a kind of hierarchy for resources, for feelings of worth, for time in the curriculum. And so I think that race itself, I don't know that it's so important to distinguish race talk from ethnicity talk, because when someone here in Boston is worrying about Cape Verdean versus black, you might call one an ethnicity, one a race, but the fact is that they're struggling over issues of power. They're struggling over issues of resources. And so, to me, that's what encapsulating arguments about Cape Verdean versus black in a race talk, calling that race talk too, makes sense to me, because it's about power and resources. Yeah.
Not unlike the umbrella of Hispanic, Latino. An interesting thing happened the first week that I came to the school. It seemed that the community was really welcoming and really friendly, because every morning that I walked up, there was a group of abuelitas and aunts and mothers and welcome, and they wanted to know if it was really true. El Principal, what was interesting is that for a long time there had been no one they could communicate with in the school office, and so this de facto disenfranchisement. And it also gave me an opportunity to get to know them. But what's interesting that given the level of communications that come to a school on an hourly basis, I take half of them because they all ask for el principal, el principal. So it's been really interesting, and regardless of the fact that whether or not I may prefer Chicano, and the kids' reactions at the first couple days of school that, in fact, this guy speaks Spanish, was very interesting, and sort of we've had some very interesting conversations since then around some of these differences.
Dorinda, you want to follow?
Yeah, I guess my follow-up to that would just be, I think the danger, because for me, is that on an adult level, we struggle. Race is about power. For kids, I think it's more so about culture. And so it may not be so much ethnicity, but these different cultures that need to be affirmed. I mean, this is what Sonia Vieto's work is about, affirming culture, which is not always synonymous to race. You know, black culture is not monolithic. I have a Southern black culture, Heather has a New England one. You know, and other people can have a different kind of black culture. So I think the danger becomes when we talk about even the racial boxes as if they are monolithic, especially in school. When kids are coming to school wanting to see their culture affirmed in the curriculum, affirmed in the extracurricular activities, not necessarily what they conceptualize, in my opinion, as race. So I think sometimes it is murky in this area of race,
Yeah.
ethnicity, culture.
Okay. I think what I found students doing was when they were talking about identities, talking about classification itself, they got into they allowed sort of for very sort of sophisticated and long debate about Southern black culture, Northern black culture, all these complexities, murkinesses, distinctions. But often when they were worried about inequality, by necessity, their race talk became much more simple. Okay, and I think that's sort of an important 21st century strategy, because if we get lost in the murkinesses, we might never be able to talk again about black graduation patterns.
And the students always understand the hierarchy that's at play.
It's never just about difference.
Hi, I have a pragmatic question more than anything else. Mica, you talked about moving from talking to talking skillfully. You also talked about moving from nervous self-consciousness to critical self-consciousness. And I'm wondering, and Mayra, you talked about the clumsiness of your first conversation. So I'm wondering if those are necessary steps in the process to talk first before talking skillfully, to go through the nervous stage before talking critically. And on a more pragmatic level, we're all from the same school. And we are in a diverse school that's nearby. And the question is, how do you begin this conversation as a faculty? We're here, which could be a really strong catalyst. But on a pragmatic level, how does an adult community begin these conversations in a way that moves towards the skill that you're
Okay.
describing?
One response I would immediately give, and then I would love to hear your responses, is that my thinking with this book, and maybe it'll flop and maybe it'll work, but is that there's something freeing about putting the dilemmas themselves on the table first. To say race talk itself is hard. In fact, we're always clumsy at it. We might always be navigating these dilemmas and never actually reach a point where we're incredibly skilled and we never mess up at race talk. I, in fact, think that every school leader should start every conversation about race with the racial achievement gap, for example, with the explicit comment that talking about race is very clumsy and we always screw it up. Okay? So for me, I don't think we ever get out of the clumsiness, but that acknowledging the clumsiness itself is crucial to starting the conversation. Okay? Eileen.
I think some things are better than others to get you started too, and I really have enjoyed the seed experiences that I've had, and I've done over the 33 years lots and lots of different kinds of diversity work. It's always called diversity work. And so far, I felt like the seed work is the most authentic. And it also helps you penetrate the people in your school a little better, because you have to start being personal. I don't know if other people on the panel have experienced that and not appreciated it, but I really enjoy received work. So just check that out.
I just want to add one thing, is that the book has two conclusions that are, the book doesn't just say, here are your dilemmas, go off and worry, but actually has two conclusions that are designed to assist this more skillful race talk that I'm advocating in the book. So we can read them together and discuss them.
Okay.
My question was related to the last question, but there's a bit of a different spin on it. My concern is white evasion of race talk. And I mean that in three ways. I think white people have three ways to not get into talking about race. We have a really sophisticated, politically correct, liberal rhetoric for, talking about class, talking about ethnicity. We could divide the African American community up into so many ethnicities that race would disappear, and we do. And so then we don't have to deal with race, and we know how, and we're good at it. And then if you push them, if you push white people, they'll say, oh, that makes me uncomfortable. And when they say that makes me uncomfortable, that's supposed to end the conversation, because white comfort is very important, and nobody can challenge white comfort, because whites say that makes me uncomfortable, so the conversation's over. And then if you really push it, then they get angry, and then they end the conversation. So those are my experiences with these kinds of things, and so I think what you're suggesting is great, but getting to that point, I think is getting to that point is the challenge. What we do at that point, I think, is what will go pretty smoothly once we get there. It's getting there that I think is difficult.
But, I think that you've already done, or you've embarked upon a very important part of the journey, and that is to pay attention to the way that we talk and to pay attention to those conversational dynamics. Because, we as a people, Americans, have a very long history of talking and not talking about race. And that has created certain patterns that we have to unlearn. But in order to do that, I think that we have to pay particular attention to one another and the words that we use and the buttons that we push. And I think that is tremendously hard work. And we don't, there haven't been a whole lot of people out there giving us sort of instructions on how to do this. I think that this book we could add to the library that I hope will soon be built.
And just to add one thing, Heather, and then you, is that, of course, white people, I don't know where you went, are talking about race. They're just talking about it quietly, and they're talking about other people as racial. And they're talking about racial patterns and blaming them on other people. So the self-analysis, my book is full of white people talking about race, but just only in certain contexts. So the sort of self-analysis of how also do I contribute to producing racial patterns, that self-analysis is a huge part of, I think, what needs to happen. Heather?
Just a tool I think that Micah and I use in the class that we teach on race here is that we pay a lot of attention to when students fall into scripts, the sort of familiar explanation for whatever, and we try to point that out to them, and I think it connects to some of the work that we've also tried to do in the teacher ed program here, is that there's always this cry, and it relates exactly to your comment, I don't feel safe having that conversation. And sometimes using the tool like there are scripts, there are embedded patterns that are historical, that are going to come up in our conversation, and part of my job as a facilitator to help this safety question, because it's really not about safety, it's about being uncomfortable. So I'm going to point this out, and it might not be just about you as an individual, it might be out here, but we're going to talk about it, we're not going to let it just go. And I think it's really useful. It's also useful, again, to have text like this to point out the script. This is what the script looks like, right? If we start to hear this, we can notice it, and We know it was in our text, so maybe we should examine it. I think those are the places where you really can sort of open up a space to push people further.
Okay. What I'd like to do is just, I think, challenge us a little bit more to think about this issue a little bit more critically. This goes back to Jed's point. I think that the words that we use in schools as educators have an immediate and direct impact on our students' identity formation, whether that be positive or negative. So I think that the point that Mica said about quality race talk is really well said, and I'd like to make that transparent in an experience that I had also teaching in Atlanta Public Schools. As Mayra said, all black students, all black faculty basically, but the talk that I heard, although it was very explicit, was actually very deconstructive. What I heard was that all black students need to be disciplined, very structured, or we need to be very strict in our classrooms because black children need a lot of discipline. What I heard was that black students need to learn standard English so that they can assimilate in the larger context of the world. And I found that to be very deconstructive on their identity formation. So what I'd like to do is encourage everybody, I think, to use race talk or engaging in race dialogue as a means to not only challenge our own assumptions about being quality educators, but as well as thinking how that lends itself to quality identity or positive identity formation of children.
Okay, thank you.
Hello, my name is Charlene Desir, and I'm a doctoral student here, and I actually study Haitian children and how they negotiate identity. And when I first came here, it wasn't my intention to have a study on race and ethnicity, but it overshadowed their lives in every aspect. And so I find myself now, wow, these kids are struggling in finding that their identity first in the school. And they have this identity that is foreign, from their country. They didn't have to deal with issues of race and ethnicity. It was class. But anyway, so now I'm in a quandary in terms of, how do I explain my data? I have data for 6 years interviewing students, and they had to give up a lot. They had to negotiate so many things. And it's to their detriment. And my focus is really looking at the social curriculum, the implicit curriculum that happens in the school around these issues and how it's totally ignored. And I hear what Dorinda's saying, and for these Haitian kids, they have to deal with race, being black. They have to deal with being a Haitian immigrant in the United States. And these are two different things and the same things at the same time, because being black, African American, is contradictory to their Haitian cultural ideals. So they are in constant conflict all the time. And I heard Eileen say, why white teachers or white people don't want to talk about these issues, and how we're at a state now where we have to be comfortable in giving up things. And that kind of struck me, and I am curious to know, what are these things? Because in the school that I've been working, it's a white middle class school, and it was always the Haitian kids. And I was a school psychologist testing the Haitian kids. And they were blamed for almost everything. And so I'm stuck, because I was in a space, UNS happened last year, and the Haitian kids was the second largest bilingual program in the city. And their program was completely dismantled, whereas every other program retained something. They were the only black immigrants in the system. So you can't ignore that race is always there, ethnicity is always there, and it interplays so intricately. But how do we begin to have conversations with majority white female teachers to start giving up? And what is it that they have to give up?
I think
invisibility.
Invisibility. I think one of the things they have to give up is the illusion that they are unimplicated in the patterns patterns involving the Haitian kids. I mean, one of the things you give up when you start talking about, have a conversation that opens with, for example, how have we all participated in producing a pattern involving the Haitian kids? What you give up when you start that conversation about mutual responsibility and communal solutions is the ability to stand back and critique other people.
And I think if you're just talking about teaching as a profession and not about resources or lots and lots of other things, you have to give up a certain self-satisfaction. You accept a certain amount of failure. And then when you start to see, oh, wow, my failures are the Haitian kids. But you still go on, and you're satisfied because you only have that little bit of failure. And and I think that's how a lot of teachers operate. And you can't operate that way and serve kids well. You have to say, we cannot accept this rate of failure or this rate of unacceptable intellectual work on the part of these kids. And that means that you can go home many days not very happy. Whereas if you accept that amount of failure, then you just say, okay, those kids are the 20% who are going to fail. So, self-satisfaction, kind of important.
Let's have this be our last question so that people can enjoy their evenings.
And
My name is Rich, and I have two questions.
Go buy the book, exactly, if you want.
My first question is kind of a question for you, Mike, but for everybody to kind of talk about. And I wonder about the role of critical mass. Because when you talk about the discrete racial groups that you talked about in California City, I think my experience coming up as a Jamaican-American / African-American, grew up in England and coming to the United States, coming to Texas, and then being told I was African-American, and nobody's really wanted to hear me talk about being Jamaican. And I actually had to, it wasn't until I came to graduate school I kind of rediscovered my ethnic part, because I was so used to being in Texas and living as African-American, because I do believe that's an accurate statement. When you are driving on the street, when you are being pulled over by the cops, you're black. It's not really about being anything but that. So that's the first question. So I'm kind of curious if there's any sort of analysis or discussion about students who may be in a group. For instance, if in California City, if there's a Haitian kid, one Haitian kid there, how did that kid identify? Where did that kid fit in? The other question I had was more of a sort of discussions about colormuteness like we're having right now is great, but the room it's 8 o'clock at night. People self-select to come out here to be part of this conversation, but how do we encourage these conversations in institutions like Hugsy, where unless you decide to come to Asquith Forum or take a class with Mica Pollock or actually take classes that talk specifically about race, to have these conversations? Because it's great to have a conversation. It's the same folks, though. It's the same faces in the room as I see every time we have this conversation. So.
I think it's integral to my task if I'm going to be successful in both negotiating and directing an organization around, at some point, opening what might be perceived as a can of worms. I mean, we can continue to look at achievement data, and we'll probably lean towards, and I know Jed's probably wondering, how do we do this? Lean towards, researching and integrating, becoming a professional learning community, But really, it comes down to a lot of the intangibles. They're not statistics. It's beginning to do what I've started to do with, a small group of teachers, and, looking at some of the work like Sarah Lawrence Lightfoot talks about the essential conversation. It's talking about the level of interactions that we have with one another as individuals, whether it's being mindful of the student-to-student talk, or the teacher-to-student talk, or the teacher-to-teacher talk, or the teacher-to-parent talk, to be mindful of all of that. And yes, we may be clumsy and we may not have it correct, but I think it's as much a variable as the extra hour tutorial we do after school. I think it's something that's going to need to be addressed if we're going to be successful ultimately.
I think that stance of inquiry that you're modeling is absolutely essential to these kinds of conversations. And I must say that, you're right that spaces are, the same in the room. On the other hand, when I gave my job talk here, I was hired. This is what I talked about, and I was hired to come here and talk about it in a sense. So I wouldn't say there's resistance of a kind, or there might be laziness of a kind, and there might be all kinds of reasons that people aren't in the room: resistance reasons, laziness reasons, tired reasons. But I wouldn't say that there's. I think a lot of people deep down would like to solve the dilemmas that they're trapped in, even though they're not very skilled at talking about them yet. But I think that deep down, a lot of people would like to solve them.
I would also say, I think one of the issues that's been true among my colleagues is this continual sense of being blamed for everything. And so I remember, for example, when my principal handed out copies of Lisa Delpit's Other People's Children a couple of years ago. And the my school is predominantly a white faculty, and the white teachers especially felt really offended by Lisa's work because they felt as if they were being blamed and as if this was a direct attack on sort of who they were and what they could accomplish. And our student support person, who's African American, had said something about how she thought it was valuable for our students, the majority of whom are not white, to have non-white teachers and to have people who can sort of enter their culture somewhat more, and or, she said, and we should really, go on neighborhood walks, really get to, go to the Walter Denny Youth Center down the street and so forth. And a lot of my colleagues were really frustrated and angry about having it be suggested that, as they saw it, they didn't care and they weren't trying. And, of course, that's not what was being said. But there is, thinking back to when Mica was talking about our taking on responsibility for some of these patterns, part of the issue, and certainly Colormute has talked about this a lot, is schools and principals and teachers are, in certain ways, accused of failing on all counts and are made to feel responsible for everything. And so I think one of the dilemmas that's not merely a race dilemma, but I think does work its way in a lot into these race dilemmas, is how we can help teachers assume responsibility without thereby also assuming the sense of inevitable blame that tends to fall. And I think that's a really hard thing to do, especially in large urban systems in which so much is data-driven, in which it's so hard to build a community of inquiry where it feels okay to admit failure. So many schools that I've been parts of feel this obligation to promote this exterior vision of success, even when we know we're not successful in many ways, because otherwise one just feels as if you're fulfilling every expectation of being a failing school, failing teacher, et cetera.
Okay. Maybe I'll just end with one of the last sentences of the book, which is that, which I believe, I wrote it, if we learn to undergird all race talk with the presumption that racial inequality itself was to be dismantled by a communal effort, including ourselves, there would soon be no reason to fear race talk at all. And I think this idea of dismantling racial inequality, that's something that we communally must do, but that's actually possible, is an essential element in having these conversations successfully. So thank you very much for coming, and thank you so much to this panel for taking the time to be here.